Hello everyone, it's Sunday school time. I'm a little late getting this to you this week, and I apologize for that. I had the privilege of being on the Boone mission team and getting back late Thursday, and then other things have kind of taken precedence, but I'm glad to be able to put the lesson together for you today. We are beginning a series in Luke. Our lesson quarterly for this quarter is Luke 1 through 9. And then the beginning of the first session, which is planned, is Luke 1, 13 through 25. There's a little bit of introductory material that has to do with the Gospel of Luke itself. Now I'm going to stray a little bit from that. I want you to get the book, you read it, and you should be familiar with that first chapter of Luke anyway. If you're not, then read it and study it. But get the book and read along. But because part of that was introduction, because in part we're starting a new book and a whole new thought process, I wanted to do an introduction for you today, just a general introduction to the Gospel of Luke. And I'll do it by beginning with the introduction to the book as Luke wrote it. Many have undertaken to complete a narrative about the events that had been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed. And so what I want to do is just do an overview of Luke. And it's very brief, but it might prove helpful for you as we begin a study of Luke that will last for 2 quarters. There's chapters 1 through 9 this quarter, and then followed by the completion of the gospel. Now, it's almost unanimous, and has been so from the earliest days of the church, that the Gospel of Luke and then the story of Acts belong together. It's one unit. And in fact, some scholars even say it was not written in 2 sections, but it was one continuous story that simply was in 2 volumes. An average scroll in the time of Jesus was about 30 feet long. Some were shorter, we know that. Some may have been longer, but a typical scroll would have been approximately 30 feet long. And our New Testament books like Matthew and Luke and John and the story of Acts itself would all have been about that length, very close to it. And so really what we're seeing is one continuous story, and Luke and Acts belongs together. So with that in mind, if you read the first part of Luke, you need to understand the story is going to continue on. Or if you're just reading in Acts, then you need to understand that there's something that happened before this, and it's one continuous story. So it's probably one writing in 2 volumes, and they really, really need to be together. When you put them together, you see some neat things. You see a progression of the gospel. In one sense, it's we see a picture of the gospel being presented geographically. The story in Luke, of course, centers around Jerusalem. Jesus is going to Jerusalem, resurrection, crucifixion. All of these things are taking place in and around Jerusalem. And then what we see is as they move through the story of Acts, you see a geographic progression. The gospel, which comes from the cross in Jerusalem, is spread throughout the area near Jerusalem, up into Asia Minor, and then it spreads across there to Ephesus, and it goes to Philippi and all the cities of Macedonia, goes into Greece, and then it travels on further into Rome. And so we see the gospel moving, and that's one of the things that we believe Luke was wanting to convey to us. And so we see the progression. We also see in that longer story that the gospel is for everyone. One Bible scholar says that one of Luke's purposes was to show that it was the Jews that crucified Jesus. They didn't get it, and so the gospel moved into the Gentile community, and certainly that is there. But I think even more important, it shows that the gospel is for everyone, Jews, Gentiles, folks in Judea, or folks in Rome. It didn't matter. The gospel is for everyone. And we see that when we see the big picture. We know also that the story of Luke, Luke's gospel, was written for believers, and in particular, Gentile believers. And that might be a good point for us to make regarding the church today, because we would fit into that category of Gentile believers. And if we do that, then we can apply the Gospel of Luke to ourselves, and I think with great effect. And so this might ought to be a gospel we spend a lot of time with, because it speaks to us in our situation. So it's written for believers, and that includes us. Luke is part of something called the synoptic tradition. You may have heard that before. Now, the word synoptic is not a word we use a lot unless it's specifically in relation to the Gospels. But it means alike, similar, same. So we have 4 Gospels in the New Testament. 3 of them are alike. They are the same. Now, what I'm going to share with you is a little bit about their sameness, but I also need you to understand that each one is unique in its approach and in its purpose. And that is especially true for Luke. But these that are part of the synoptic tradition are Matthew and Mark and Luke. It's generally considered that Mark was the first of those 3 Gospels written. And one of the reasons we think that is because almost all of Mark, the great majority of Mark, is in Luke. It's also in Matthew. And so just when you study literature, it makes sense that they have copied, borrowed from Mark, and used his material rather than the other way around. For many years, folks thought Matthew was first. Well, it's really kind of hard to figure that. Why would Mark only pull out part of Matthew? It makes more sense that Matthew used all of Mark, or most of it. And so just from the study of literature and from other sources, we understand that Mark was written first, and then Luke used a lot of Mark. Matthew used a lot of Mark. And so that's one of the reasons they are similar. Another reason is there's a certain amount of material that Luke uses and Matthew uses that Mark does not use. And so they either borrowed from each other, or there's an unknown source out there that they both used. And you might think, wow, are you saying they used and copied work with each other? Well, of course I am. Luke said it right up at the front. He said, I did my research. And just like anyone today, any preacher today, he's going to use his commentaries, his dictionaries, his books, his literature. He's going to pull from here in order to give a good, solid sermon. So that hasn't changed. That's the same. Don't let that part bother you. So what we have is that's going on. And then there are parts of Luke that are just Luke. Mark didn't do it. Matthew didn't use it. Nobody did. It's Luke. And so you have at least 3 sources here that Luke used. He used Mark. He used Matthew, or a similar source that both he and Matthew used. And then he used his own material. Now, in that process, what we find is a lot of similarities. Therefore, we use the word synoptic. But we also find that it stands alone. Each of these 3 Gospels is written for a purpose. And part of Luke's purpose was to write to a Gentile community. Part of his purpose has historically been known as evangelism. He's trying to win souls for the Lord. Part of his purpose was showing that the Jews didn't get it and they rejected Christ. Part of his purpose was to reach out to the down and outs of his society. And when you start looking at his purpose, and this is one thing we need to know, at least according to the New American Commentary, what we find is that there is no singular purpose that is standing out above all others in Luke, but he had many purposes, and all of these come through. So if you're going to look at Luke and say, hey, this is it, and everything else is secondary, you might have a hard time with that. But if you look at it and say, this is it, and he also said this and this and this, and they're all important too, then you'll get a better grasp on Luke and on Acts as well. And so that's what we're going to see in Luke. Now, part of that purpose that I've known for many years is that he did care for those that are the down and out. And that comes out in the first 2 chapters. The 2 of the key figures in the first 2 chapters happen to be Elizabeth and Mary. Women. You might say, women, yes, in their place in society. Women were not at the same level as men. And so Luke spends a lot of time with women and with others. And so right off the bat, we see that emphasis that he has caring for people. Another thing that we need to recognize is that Luke saw himself as a historian. He mentions that in his prologue. He said, I have researched it and I have talked to people. Luke was not one of the original believers in Jerusalem. And so how he came to faith and how he learned about faith, he doesn't share with us here, but we know that he did, and then he took the time to research what he was believing to be true. And he says clearly that he has tried his very best to put down absolute truth as he has investigated it. And so he sees himself as a historian. What that says to us, as long as his history is accurate, is that the Gospel of Luke is a reliable source for what happened in those early days of the faith. And so we see a history. A lot of folks don't see Matthew, Mark, Luke as history, but they are, and we need to understand that. He wrote to the most excellent Theophilus. We don't know who Theophilus was. Most people today believe that he was a person, a man that Luke knew, and that he wrote to him, and he gave him a high honor with the title. The title would have been one that was sometimes reserved for governors or important people, but we don't know for sure that Theophilus was, but he was certainly important to Luke, and so he honored him with his title and wrote to him. And if it's to a single person, that's pretty neat. I think that's pretty cool that Luke took all his time to write this down, to share with Theophilus, and I would think quite naturally through Theophilus to others, about the story of Christ. But here's something neat, and I'm not going to tell you that this is the way it is, although some have said so. The name Theophilus means friend of God. If it indeed is a generic name or one that Luke just kind of used or pulled out of the hat, could it be that he is writing his gospel and his history, which is the book of Acts? Could it be that he is writing that to a generic person so that anyone who would be considered a friend of God could be reading this as if it were written to them? Now, I think Theophilus was probably a single person, and yet I'm really intrigued by the idea that Luke could have written in such a way that he had you or me or someone else, anyone else, in mind as he wrote. If we would say that we would want to be considered a friend of God, that we are indeed Theophilus, then wouldn't it be neat to think that all those years ago, Luke wrote with us in mind? I think that's a neat and intriguing thought, and I like it a lot, even though I think Theophilus was a friend of Luke and a real person. We also see that Luke wrote well. He wrote with a high quality. The introduction that I read to you, the first 4 verses, is rather typical for Greek writing. He followed the norms of his day and in setting up this, and he began to write, and he did what's normal, just like, you know, when I was a kid and learning to write letters, it would go like this: Dear somebody, how are you? I am fine. I hope you are well too. And we would have some normal ways to do things. And so he did that. But what's neat is that Luke did it well. It's been said that this is one of the highest quality Greek introductions in all of the literature that we have available to us. And I'm always amazed when I read it and learn that, because we know the Gospel of John was written very beautifully. We now know that Luke is written very well. Some people say that 1 Peter could not have been written by Peter because the Greek is too good. And I think what we're finding is that God has sharp people in mind, and he uses their skills, and he put together a Bible that is well done. And when you see it even in English, it's a beautiful introduction, and it's high quality. And we need to know that when we're studying it, it is a high quality book. Then let me just share 2 other things quickly. I'm right on my time frame, but if I can get it in, then we can move on next week to another topic. Luke was a friend of Paul. We believe he is the great, or the good physician that's listed elsewhere. We see him as a historian. He was not a first-generation Christian, but really close. And when you get into Acts, you see a change about halfway through. It changes from third person to first person. He stops saying, and they went here, and they went here, and they did this. And then he starts saying, we did this. So Luke would have been a participant in the early days of the church and in the early mission of the church, and part of the evangelism and the church planting that Paul engaged in. And so we have a good, reliable, early Christian who knew people and who was wise and who wrote for us. Finally, let me give it a date. The earliest possible date for this would have been in the 60s because we know the date of Paul's death, and he has written and finished Acts before Paul died. And so what we have is that the earliest would be the early 60s. And then the end possibilities could be any time. Some have said the 70s, and some have said 80s or 90s, and they stretch it on out. And I'm not too worried about that part, but I would suggest that this was written somewhere between 60 and 70 AD. What's that say to us? It's pretty early. It's not something that was written in 1950. It was written a long time ago, while it was early, while it was fresh, while there were still eyewitnesses, while there were still people who knew the story intimately, knew it firsthand. So we have a book that has been around for a long, long time. And it is one that from the earliest days of church history has been attested as complete and true and by Luke himself. Very, very little option on that. And so what we have is a good quality gospel, well written, and written for folks to know the story of Christ. Now, that's a general introduction, very quick, very brief, but one that I hope will help you as you are studying the Gospel of Luke over the next several lessons. It's an excellent gospel, one that modern Christians should pay more attention to, and I hope it will be meaningful and powerful for you. Well, God bless you as you read and as you study the Gospel of Luke.